triggered the first human civilizations to appear so abruptly, so insistently, when so much of earlier life seems to dissolve into silence. The oldest cities do not feel like a gentle continuation of campfires and footpaths. They feel, at times, like a hard cut in the film, stone walls where there were reeds, stamped seals where there were voices, inventories where there were stories. And in that cut something is missing. Not just objects, but the sensation that someone once understood the steps in between, and then stopped explaining them. So before anyone lets the body sink completely into this comfort, there is one small request. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if the work here truly feels worth returning to. And if the mood is right, share a location and the local time in the comments, as though pinning a tiny lantern to the map, proving that this listening is happening somewhere real. The contradiction remains, even as the room grows quieter. For most of human time, people moved, adapted, gathered, hunted, shared, argued, rested. They left behind hearths, flakes of stone, scattered bones, faint stains of pigment. And then, within a relatively short span, there are cities, places that demand permanence, predictability, and obedience to things that do not breathe. Taxes, measures, stored grain, laws. When later generations tell the story, they prefer a smooth ascent, a ladder of improvement. But the ground beneath the ladder is uneven. Certain layers are burned, certain years are blank, certain explanations arrive far too late, already polished, already safe. The first true problem is definition. A civilization is often described as if it were a natural species: writing, cities, monumental architecture, administrative systems, specialized labor. But these traits do not always arrive together, and when they do not always feel like a celebration. The earliest city walls are not metaphors, they are evidence of fear. The earliest granaries are not romantic, they are statements about hunger, winter, and someone deciding who eats first. If civilization is a solution, then it must have been solving something sharp enough to justify surrendering a great deal of freedom. The question becomes less flattering, more intimate. What kind of pressure makes people accept a life of schedules, rules, and crowded air? Archaeology can measure the thickness of a destruction layer. It can date charred beams. It can map streets buried under silt. What it struggles to capture is motive, the precise feeling that spreads through a community when old ways stop working. The last ice age loosened its grip, the climate warmed, seas rose, forests shifted, rivers changed their moods. In some places, abundance increased. In others, the familiar rhythm of seasons became strange. People are not pushed towards cities by comfort alone. Comfort invites lingering, but it does not demand hierarchy. The earlier city is not simply a larger village. It is a different instrument, tuned to a harsher kind of problem, the need to store, to defend, to coordinate strangers, to make tomorrow behave. The evidence of that coordination is everywhere once it appears. In Mesopotamia, the oldest urban systems grow from landscapes that are both generous and dangerous, floodplains that can feed thousands, and rivers that can erase a harvest overnight. Irrigation channels do not dig themselves. Dikes do not maintain themselves. A single breach can ruin an entire season. In such a place, cooperation becomes survival, and survival can be organized into power. Someone must decide when canals are cleared, who works where, how much is taken, how much is stored. At first, that someone might simply be a council, an elder, a skilled organizer. But structures have a habit of hardening. A temporary role becomes an office becomes a class becomes a story about why it deserves to exist. Then there is grain, quiet, humble grain, the kind that does not look like destiny until it is already controlling the calendar. Domesticated cereals have a peculiar magic. They can be stored, counted, redistributed. They turn food into a measurable substance, and measurement is the beginning of administration. A herd can wander, wild foods appear unpredictably, but grain sits, waiting, accumulating, becoming both security and temptation. Once grain exists in quantity, theft becomes a major fear. Once theft becomes a fear, guards become a job. Once guards exist, someone must command them. Civilization can begin, not with art, but with the simple question of who holds the key to the storeroom. There are earlier hints that the human mind was already capable of building something complex before cities. Long before writing, there were symbolic behaviours, long-distance exchange, ritual spaces, carefully shaped objects carried across landscapes. There are sites that refuse to fit neatly into the familiar story, places that suggest planning and shared meaning without obvious kings or palaces. These hints are not proof of a hidden empire, but they are enough to complicate the comforting narrative that everything began only when farming became efficient. Sometimes the evidence points in the opposite direction, that shared ritual and social cohesion may have helped gather people first, creating the conditions for agriculture to intensify later. The sequence farm first, city later is tidy. Human history rarely is. When a society grows large enough, it begins to need a new kind of memory. Oral tradition is powerful, but it depends on trust and attention. In a dense settlement, trust becomes expensive and attention becomes scarce. The earliest accounting systems in the ancient Near East, tokens, sealings, markings on clay, feel like small, almost unromantic steps, yet they hint at a revolution more profound than a new tool. They suggest a moment when memory stopped living only inside the body and began living on objects. A mark can outlast a person. A mark can be carried to another room, another building, another generation. And once marks exist, the person who controls the marks controls reality in a new way. Not the reality of weather or childbirth, but the reality of who owes what, who belongs where, who's allowed to speak for the community. Writing, in its earliest forms, often appears closely tied to administration. Lists, quantities, transactions. This is not a condemnation, it is a clue. The earliest civilizations may have been triggered less by sudden brilliance than by a slow tightening of constraints. Climate variability, population pressure, resource competition, the need to manage water, the need to protect stored food. In that tightening, bureaucracy is not a luxury, it is a coping mechanism. Yet coping mechanisms can become cages. A system built to prevent famine can become a machine that extracts surplus for elites. A wall built to keep enemies out can keep citizens in. A calendar built to time planting can time labour demands. The same tools that stabilise a community can also standardize it, flattening difference, punishing those who do not fit. There is a shadow that follows this story, and it is the shadow of erasure. When later empires rose, they copied, curated, and sometimes destroyed. Archives burned, libraries collapsed, languages vanished. A civilization that loses its script becomes invisible to those who cannot read it. A city that is abandoned becomes a mound, then a legend, then a footnote. Even in modern times, what survives is often what is easiest to categorize and display. Archaeology has its own pressures: funding, politics, nationalism, the seduction of tidy narratives. None of this requires a single hidden hand controlling history. It only requires a world where attention is limited and power prefers simple stories. The past is not only discovered, it is selected. And so the question remains oddly alive. Did the first civilizations appear because humans finally advanced, or because the world became unstable enough to force new forms of organization? Or more unsettlingly, did they appear multiple times, experiments in dense living that rose, fractured, and were rebuilt, so that what is called the first is merely the first that left enough durable traces to be recognized? In some regions, there are signs of discontinuity, settlement patterns shifting abruptly, material styles changing, layers of ash and abandonment. Collapse is not an exception in early complex societies, it is a recurring rhythm. A city can be both an achievement and a vulnerability, a concentration of resources and therefore a target of war, of disease, of climate shocks, of internal conflict. If a trigger must be named, it may not be one event but an atmosphere. An era in which humans learned that survival could be engineered, but only by binding themselves to systems larger than any one life. Water schedules, harvest cycles, storehouse counts, social debts, ritual obligations. A civilization is not simply a place, it is a contract written into daily behaviour. And contracts can feel sacred when they are new, because they promise protection from chaos. That promise can be intoxicating, it can also be costly. Tonight, the oldest cities stand at the edge of that cost, like silhouettes against a faint horizon. They do not explain themselves fully. They offer walls, tablets, graves, and the quiet evidence that someone somewhere decided the future would be managed. And yet the most important moment, the instant a community collectively stepped into the machinery of permanence, still resists being pinned down. Was it hunger that made people accept the counting of grain, or fear that made them accept the building of walls? Was it climate that drove them together, or the seduction of a new kind of power that grew once togetherness became unavoidable? And when the first lights of civilization flickered into being, did they illuminate a new beginning? Or did they merely reveal how much had already been lost in the darkness behind them? If the first lights of civilization only revealed how much had already been lost behind them, then the next question becomes uncomfortable in a different way. What exactly was changing in the world so fast that humans began building permanence like a shelter, not a celebration? The usual story likes a gentle sunrise. People discover farming. Farming creates surplus. Surplus creates cities. But the ground beneath that sunrise was not stable. It was moving, warming, flooding, drying, and rearranging itself with a patience that can still feel like intent when seen from far away. A village can endure uncertainty by moving. A city cannot. So why choose the one arrangement of life that punishes you most when nature becomes unpredictable? After the last ice age loosened, the planet did not simply become kinder. It became different. And difference is a form of stress. Coastlines shifted as sea levels rose. River valleys widened and braided. Marshlands appeared where there had been open plains. In some places, new wetlands promised rich soil and fish. In others, familiar routes vanished underwater. The climate did not warm like a steady hand turning up a lamp. It pulsed, it hesitated, it lurched in episodes that left ecological fingerprints. Tree lines moving, pollen records changing, lakes swelling and shrinking. For a forager band, a bad season is hardship. For a growing settlement with stored grain, livestock and fixed dwellings, a bad season becomes a test of whether the whole arrangement deserves to survive. There is a quiet, recurring pattern in the earliest regions that later became cradles of civilization. They sit in environments that are productive yet demanding, places where abundance exists, but only for those who cooperate with water and time. Floodplains do this with a kind of cold generosity. A river can renew the soil and feed thousands, but it can also arrive at the wrong moment and undo months of labour. When floods are predictable, they can be celebrated as a calendar. When they become erratic, they become a threat that feels personal, as though the world is no longer following the old agreement. In such an atmosphere, it's easy to imagine the slow psychological shift. People begin to crave not only food, but control. Control over storage, control over labour, control over prediction, control over each other, if that is what it takes to make tomorrow behave. This is where the story gains a sharper edge. Because the first civilizations appear not only alongside rivers, but alongside counting days, counting jars, counting fields, counting mouths. A warm and variable climate can produce more resources overall, but it can also create sharper swings. Surplus is not just extra food. Surplus is a buffer against surprise. The moment surprise becomes frequent, buffers become sacred. And once buffers exist, someone must decide how they are used. The earliest administrative practices, whether they take the form of tokens, sealings, marks, or later full writing, can be read as an answer to a single anxious question. How does a community remember what it is owed, and by whom, when memory is no longer enough? Population adds another pressure that does not announce itself with thunder. A region that grows steadily can reach a threshold where old social tools stop working. In a small group, reputation is a kind of law. Everyone knows everyone. Shame and praise travel quickly. But when settlements expand, strangers become normal, and strangers are not only new friends, they are new variables. They do not carry the same obligations. They do not feel the same history. A larger settlement can be rich in skills and trade, but it is also rich in friction. The first cities did not only require walls against outsiders, they required new ways to prevent insiders from tearing each other apart. Rules, rituals, hierarchies and records are solutions to the problem of living among people whose faces you cannot memorize. Yet this still does not fully explain the sensation of acceleration, the feeling that something flips. The archaeological record often suggests long periods of experimentation, proto-urban neighborhoods, seasonal aggregation sites, villages that swell and shrink before the unmistakable features of city life appear. Then, in certain regions, a density arrives that feels like a decision. Streets align, buildings cluster, storage becomes centralized, specialized crafts intensify, trade distances widen. It is tempting to call this progress, but it might be better understood as a narrowing of options. When a region reaches a point where resources, people, and risk all concentrate, the easiest way to survive may be to concentrate harder. Centralize, standardize, organize. Civilization can be an emergent behavior under pressure, the way a flock tightens when predators circle, and predators did circle, not always as roaming armies in the familiar sense, but as raids, feuds, and the quiet arithmetic of scarcity. Stored food attracts violence the way light attracts insects. A granary is a promise that there is something worth stealing. The appearance of fortifications in early settlements hints that conflict was not an afterthought. It was present enough to shape architecture. When walls appear, they also change psychology. A wall tells the people inside that there is an inside, and that belonging has a boundary. It turns community into a category, and categories are the raw material of politics. Once politics exists, it needs language, spoken and later written, to justify itself. It needs stories about why certain people lead and others follow. It needs symbols that make obedience feel like tradition rather than surrender. Here, the sacred enters the scene not as a separate realm, but as a stabilizing force woven into daily logistics. A ritual calendar can synchronize planting and harvest. A priestly class can preserve seasonal knowledge. A temple can become a storehouse, a redistribution center, a place where offerings resemble taxes and taxes resemble offerings. This does not mean religion is merely a tool of control. It means that in early dense communities, the sacred and the practical naturally braid together because both address uncertainty. The storm, the flood, the drought, the disease. These are not abstract threats. They are the invisible rulers of early life. When humans cannot command them directly, they build systems that feel like command. Ceremonies, taboos, hierarchical offices, and accounts carved into durable matter. But there is another discomfort that begins to show itself if the gaze lingers. The earliest civilizations did not only appear, they also broke, again and again. Cities rise, then thin out. Regions flourish, then show signs of strain. Soil salinizes under irrigation. Rivers shift their courses. Trade networks collapse under conflict or distance. Epidemics find dense populations irresistible. When collapse happens, it can erase the very evidence needed to understand origins. A burned archive does not just end a story, it removes the ability to know what the story once said. A flooded city does not only drown people, it drowns records. And when later societies rebuild, they often build on top of ruins, compressing centuries into a mound, turning lived experience into layered silence. So the trigger may not be a single spark, but a repeating mechanism. Climate variability intensifying the need for storage and coordination. Growing populations increasing friction and the need for rules. Concentrated resources inviting conflict and the need for defense. Uncertainty encouraging ritual and centralized authority. Centralized authority producing records. Records enabling larger systems of extraction and organization. Each step feels practical in the moment. Each step also makes the next step more likely. Civilization, in this view, is not a triumphal invention. It is a chain reaction of adaptations that gradually becomes difficult to reverse. And still, the missing step haunts the edges. Because if early people were responding to instability, then the sudden appearance of cities might be less about human genius and more about human fear. Yet fear leaves a strange kind of trace, not in bones, but in choices. Choosing to stay put when leaving would be easier. Choosing to store grain in a communal place rather than many private places. Choosing to accept someone else's measure of value. Choosing to let marks on clay settle disputes that voices once handled. These choices are small, almost invisible, but together they create a world where the past can be managed and the future can be demanded. The question that follows is quieter and perhaps sharper than the last. If climate and pressure were the wind, what was the sail? What inner human appetite caught that wind and pulled communities toward hierarchy and permanence instead of dispersal and flexibility? Was the first city born from necessity alone, or from the first time someone realized that necessity could be shaped into authority, and authority could be made to feel inevitable? The thought that necessity could be shaped into authority has a way of lingering, because it suggests civilization may not have begun with a discovery, but with a bargain, one that sounded reasonable at first, and then became difficult to refuse. And if that is true, the next place to look is not at palaces or temples, but at something quieter, almost too ordinary to be the engine of a new world. Grain. Not the poetic grain of myth, but the hard, counted grain that sits in darkness and waits, patient as a promise. A hunter can fail and try again tomorrow. A forager can shift routes when a grove dries up. But farming introduces a different kind of risk. Delayed risk. The work is front-loaded, the reward arrives later, and the interval in between becomes a corridor where anxiety can breed. Seeds go into the soil, and for weeks or months the future is out of reach. During that waiting, a storm can flatten the stalks, an insect swarm can chew through the field, a flood can drown the young plants, a drought can turn everything into brittle straw. The harvest is not merely food, it is a verdict. And once people organize their lives around a verdict, they begin to build institutions to influence it, or at least to survive it. This is why grain becomes more than nutrition. Its true power is that it can be stored, it can be divided, it can be moved, it can be taxed, it can be used to feed someone who is not farming, which means it can support specialists, builders, potters, guards, priests, scribes. A surplus does not automatically create hierarchy, but it creates the possibility of hierarchy, the way a pile of dry wood creates the possibility of fire. The crucial moment is when storage becomes centralized, when food is gathered into a single place and watched over. That place can be called a granary, a temple storehouse, a communal cache. In practice, it becomes a throat through which the life of the settlement must pass. Whoever controls the throat controls the rhythm of hunger and relief. At first, this control can appear compassionate. Central storage can protect a community from bad seasons. It can support widows, orphans, the injured. It can provide seed grain for the next planting. In climates where variability is rising, such storage looks like wisdom. Yet centralization has a second face, one that becomes clearer only over time. If food is concentrated, it becomes easier to count. If it is counted, it can be claimed. If it is claimed, it can be redistributed in ways that create dependency. A community that once shared informally begins to share through a gatekeeper, and gatekeepers rarely remain invisible. The earliest forms of counting in ancient societies feel humble, almost like toys. Small clay tokens shaped into cones, spheres, discs, each representing a commodity. Over time, these tokens become sealed inside clay envelopes, then pressed onto surfaces, then replaced by marks that stand in for the objects. The detail matters because it shows a subtle psychological shift. Once a mark can represent grain, grain can be managed at a distance. Once management at a distance becomes normal, authority can detach from the field and settle into an office. A person no longer needs to grow food to control food. They need only to control the records. This is not a tale of villains. It is a tale of systems doing what systems do, persisting, expanding, protecting themselves. A scribe with a tablet can be as essential as a farmer with a sickle when the settlement reaches a certain size. But what is essential can become sacred, and what is sacred can become unquestionable. The moment a community believes that its survival depends on a particular arrangement, this storehouse, this priesthood, this administrative class, it becomes vulnerable to manipulation. Not necessarily by conspiracy, but by the simple incentives that arise when people discover they can turn necessity into leverage. There is another quiet trait of grain that makes it unusually suited to building early states. It ripens at a predictable time and must be harvested quickly. This creates seasonal labor demands. Many hands are needed all at once. Coordination becomes valuable. Those who coordinate can demand something in return. In contrast, many wild resources are gathered more continuously and opportunistically, which resists central control. Grain funnels labor into concentrated moments, and those moments can be organized into obligation. The harvest becomes not only work, but a social event, a ritual, a time when a leader can be seen leading, when a temple can be seen blessing, when an authority can be seen receiving. This leads to the emergence of another strange invention: debt. Debt does not require coins. It requires measurement, expectation, enforcement. A farmer borrows seed grain, promising repayment after harvest. A family receives rations during lean months, promising labour later. Debt creates future obligations that can be transferred, recorded, and used to bind people to a system. In small groups, obligations are personal and flexible. In larger settlements, obligations become abstract and rigid. They can be inherited. They can be used to justify inequality. A child can be born into a debt they never agreed to, simply because the system has learned how to make the future belong to the past. Here, civilization begins to resemble a machine that runs on time measured in seasons, in planting cycles, in ration schedules, a machine that requires predictability and punishes disruption. This is why early civilizations are often obsessed with calendars, omens, and the interpretation of signs. Predicting the river flood is not mystical in intent, it is administrative. Knowing when to plant is not a philosophical curiosity, it is survival. Yet the line between survival knowledge and sacred authority is thin. If a priestly class controls astronomical knowledge, it can control the timing of rituals and harvest, and thus the distribution of legitimacy. The sky becomes a ledger, the stars become a schedule, and people who can read the schedule become indispensable. It is in this atmosphere that the mythic tone enters human history with new weight. Not because humans suddenly became more imaginative, humans always were, but because imagination gained a new job. explaining why the system must be obeyed. A story can turn an administrative demand into a cosmic principle. It can turn a grain tax into an offering. It can turn a ruler's authority into divine mandate. Again, this does not require deception in the modern sense. It requires alignment. The system needs stability. Belief provides stability. A ritual that brings people together can reduce conflict. A shared myth can unify strangers. But unity comes at a price. It often requires suppressing alternative ways of living, alternative stories, alternative memories of how things used to be. And this is where loss begins to look less like accident and more like a pattern. When a way of life becomes dominant, it tends to rewrite the landscape to suit itself. Foragers become marginal. Mobility becomes suspicious. The forest becomes a resource rather than a home. Knowledge that cannot be counted is treated as unreliable. Oral traditions that do not serve the new order fade, not because someone burns them deliberately, but because children learn what keeps them fed. They learn the language of the storeroom and the temple. They learn the marks that decide rations. They learn the rules that keep them inside the walls. If this is the trigger, grain turning survival into accounting, then civilization begins with a very intimate trade, the trade of flexibility for security. In a world where climate and population pressures are tightening, security is seductive. Yet security creates dependency, and dependency invites hierarchy. The first cities may have been built not only to keep danger out, but to keep people in the system that promised protection from danger. So the question shifts again, becoming less about why did civilizations appear, and more about why did they stay? Many humans could have returned to older ways when systems became oppressive. Some did, but many did not, even when the costs of city life, disease, inequality, labour demands became obvious. The system had captured the future through storage, through debt, through records, through ritual. It had learned how to make leaving feel like starvation, even in a landscape that still held wild food. And in the background, another thought grows louder as the night continues. If grain and storage created the first administrative power, then whoever mastered water would become even more powerful, because without water, grain is only a dream. The next layer of the fog waits at the edge of the riverbanks, where channels cut through soil like lines drawn by a hand that expects obedience. The riverbanks wait like a boundary between two kinds of life, the older life that follows water and the newer life that tries to command it. Grain can be counted, stored, taxed, and traded, but grain is helpless without moisture arriving in the right amount, at the right time, in the right place. And this is where the first civilizations begin to look less like spontaneous blossoms and more like engineered systems, delicate machines built on top of landscapes that refuse to stay still. It is easy to romanticize rivers in hindsight. The Nile becomes a benevolent pulse. The Tigris and Euphrates become ancient arteries. The Indus becomes a forgotten corridor of brick and drainage. The Yellow River becomes a cradle. Yet the more closely one listens, the more these rivers sound like unpredictable rulers. They flood, they shift course, they deposit silt, they cut new channels, they erase fields. They sometimes arrive too soon or not at all. A small community can adapt by moving, by diversifying, by keeping commitments light. A city cannot move, so it must do something bolder. It must alter the landscape and then alter human behaviour, so the altered landscape keeps functioning. Irrigation seems at first like a practical improvement. Dig a canal, divert water, expand farmland, feed more people. But irrigation is never merely engineering. It is social choreography. Someone must decide where the canal goes, whose land receives water first, who repairs breaches, who clears silt, who's punished when a gate is tampered with. In such a system, cooperation is not optional. A single family can ruin an entire network by refusing labour or stealing water at the wrong moment. This creates a new kind of vulnerability, and vulnerability often invites authority. The canal does not just bring water, It brings a reason for supervision. In Mesopotamia, the logic is almost ruthless. The floodplain offers fertility, but rainfall is often unreliable. Irrigation becomes the bridge between potential and survival. Yet irrigation in this region also carries a long-term cost, salinization. When water evaporates under hot sun, salts remain in the soil. Over time, yields decline. A society dependent on irrigated grain can respond by expanding into new land, by adjusting crops, by intensifying labour, by demanding more tribute, anything to keep the system from admitting its limits. Civilization in this light can be a structure that pushes forward not because it is thriving, but because it is avoiding collapse. Growth becomes a way of outrunning damage. The Nile offers a different rhythm, more predictable historically, yet still capable of disaster. Its cycles can support a grand agricultural calendar, but even a predictable river becomes a problem when population grows dense enough that small deviations become catastrophic. A low flood can mean famine. A high flood can mean ruined homes. The need to measure, forecast, and coordinate becomes intense. Here, the rise of centralized authority can feel from one angle like an answer to fear, a state as a flood management tool. Yet from another angle, centralized authority can become self-justifying, claiming sacred necessity even when the river does not demand it. A ruler can present themselves as the mediator between people and water, turning hydrology into legitimacy. The Indus world adds another whisper to the story, because it complicates easy assumptions: urban planning, standardized weights, elaborate drainage. Signs of coordination without obvious royal monuments in the same style as Mesopotamia or Egypt. It suggests that early urban life might take multiple forms, some less visibly hierarchical than others, at least in how they present themselves materially. And this raises a subtle suspicion. Perhaps the trigger is not a specific political model, but the broader requirement of managing flows: water, goods, waste, people. Different cultures solve the flow problem differently. The presence of urban order does not automatically reveal who held power. It reveals that power existed somewhere in the system. Rivers do something else that is easy to overlook. They create maps in the mind. A canal network is a kind of imposed geometry. It teaches people to think in lines, boundaries, measured distances. Field divisions become more regular. Property becomes more legible. Legibility is not neutral. A state prefers a landscape it can read. A person who wishes to live beyond supervision prefers a landscape that is messy, ambiguous, thick with hiding places. Irrigation and land measurement make land easier to tax and harder to vanish into. The shape of the countryside begins to mirror the shape of administration. Once land is measured, it becomes a unit. Once it becomes a unit, it becomes transferable. Once it becomes transferable, inequality can become structural rather than accidental. A family can accumulate more fields. A temple can hold land as an institution. A ruler can grant land as a reward. Over time, the soil itself becomes a ledger, and the ledger begins to determine social rank. Civilization stability then rests on an uncomfortable foundation. Someone must remain poor enough to work the land, while someone else remains secure enough to command. With rivers comes another invisible tyranny: maintenance. Canals silt up, dikes weaken, floodgates rot. Without constant labour, the entire system collapses into swamp or dust. This means that early states may have grown partly because they needed large organised workforces simply to keep their infrastructure alive. It is not only that the state chooses to be large. Sometimes the state must be large to avoid being erased by sediment and season. Here, the boundary between public good and forced labour becomes thin. A community can volunteer to maintain canals when trust is high. When trust decays, rulers enforce maintenance through obligation, ration control, punishment. The water becomes an argument for authority. Without obedience there will be no harvest. And when obedience is demanded, it rarely arrives naked. It arrives dressed as ritual, tradition, cosmic order. The river's mood becomes a moral message. The flood is interpreted as favour or warning. The king or the temple becomes the interpreter of that warning. Over time, the system learns to fold practical governance into sacred narratives so tightly that separating them feels like sacrilege. A canal gate is no longer only wood and mud. It is an emblem of order. A labour draft is no longer only a demand. It is a duty to the gods or ancestors. Yet beneath the official stories, another tension hums. Water is life, but water is also conflict. Upstream and downstream communities compete. Fields closest to canals receive more reliable irrigation. Powerful households can divert water subtly at night. Disputes over water require arbitration, and arbitration creates judges. Judges create precedent. Precedent creates law. Law creates the sense that the system is permanent, and permanence invites deeper investment. Soon, a community cannot imagine life without the canal network, even if the canal network has become a chain around their ankles. Leaving would mean abandoning fields, homes, stored grain, social ties, and whatever protection the walls provide. The river does not merely feed the city, it binds it. This binding helps explain why the first urban worlds could persist despite their costs. Dense living is harsh, disease spreads faster, waste accumulates, conflict intensifies, inequality becomes visible every day. But a well-managed water and grain system can outcompete dispersed lifestyles in sheer output. It can support specialists, warriors, builders. It can build walls and enforce borders. Over time, it creates a feedback loop. Infrastructure enables surplus, surplus enables power, power enables more infrastructure. The city becomes a machine that keeps rejustifying itself, and still, the fog does not lift completely. Because if rivers and irrigation were such powerful triggers, one might expect civilizations to appear everywhere water exists. They did not. There were long stretches of history where sophisticated societies flourished without dense cities, and other regions where agriculture existed without states for a very long time. So irrigation cannot be the sole cause. It is a lever, but a lever requires a hand. The hand may be population pressure, conflict, trade, belief, or something less visible, an idea about what life should be. The question begins to tilt toward that less visible realm. Once water, land, and grain become legible and countable, someone must manage the symbols that represent them, and as symbols multiply, seals, measures, marks, tallies, the true engine of civilization may shift from soil to clay, from rivers to records. The next layer waits where fingers press into wet tablets, leaving impressions that outlast voices, turning human speech into something that can be stored, audited, and used long after the speaker is gone. If irrigation taught the landscape to behave, records taught people to behave. There is a particular kind of power in a mark that cannot be argued with, at least not easily. A voice can be contradicted, a memory can be challenged, but a sealed impression on clay, backed by an institution, carries a colder authority. It sits in silence and insists that something is true. A debt exists, a field belongs to someone, a shipment arrived, a ration was issued, a promise was made. And once a society begins to trust marks more than mouths, a new kind of reality is born, one that can be stored, transported, and enforced across distance and time. The early stages feel almost innocent. A token to represent a quantity of grain, a seal to close a storeroom, a standardized weight to ensure a fair exchange. These are not dramatic inventions, they are the quiet tools of coordination. But coordination scales, and scaling has consequences. When a village becomes large, managing it through personal relationships becomes difficult. Systems emerge to replace intimacy, measures, lists, roles, offices. Civilization, here, looks like the point where human relationships are no longer enough to hold society together. So people build substitutes, administrative scaffolding that can support strangers leaning on the same structure. It is tempting to imagine writing as a sudden creative breakthrough, a gift of brilliance. Yet the oldest surviving texts often sound like counting. They are lists of commodities, tallies of livestock, records of rations, inventories of offerings. Even when they are not fully readable in modern eyes, their function is clear. They exist to keep the system running. This does not make writing less wondrous. It makes it more revealing. The first civilizations may have been triggered not only by surplus and irrigation, but by a crisis of complexity. Too many mouths, too many fields, too many transactions, too many obligations. The mind reached for an external memory because internal memory could no longer carry the weight. External memory changes the shape of power because it makes power portable. A leader who must personally visit every field is limited. An administrator who can send a sealed tablet can reach farther. The tablet becomes a proxy for authority. It can travel to distant storehouses, distant work crews, distant trading partners. It can instruct, demand, threaten, reward, and because it is durable, it can accumulate into archives. Archives become institutional memory, and institutional memory becomes a kind of immortality. A person dies, the records remain. A dynasty can claim continuity because its documents say so. A temple can claim land because a tablet says so. Reality becomes increasingly what can be proven with marks. This is where the human atmosphere begins to change. Once records exist, they invite auditing. They invite suspicion. If a society is keeping lists, it can compare lists. Discrepancies become accusations. Accusations require adjudication. Adjudication creates courts. Courts create law. Law creates categories of crime. Crime creates punishment. Punishment requires enforcement. Enforcement requires specialists in violence. The system thickens layer by layer until daily life is threaded through institutions that would have been unimaginable in a small band of foragers. The original purpose may have been survival. The outcome is governance. In that thickening, people begin to encounter a new sensation, being known by the state. A person becomes a unit, a worker, a taxpayer, a debtor, a ration recipient. Names become important in a new way. Identity becomes legible to an institution, and legibility is double-edged. It can protect rights. It can also trap someone in obligations that are no longer personal or negotiable. A debt recorded on clay cannot be softened by friendship. A ration schedule cannot be adjusted by sympathy, not without leaving a trace. The warmth of human flexibility cools into the logic of administration. Seals are especially suggestive in this regard. A seal impression is an early signature, an emblem that says, "This action is authorized." It links a person, or an office, to a transaction. Yet seals also create a world where authority is expressed through symbols rather than presence. An official does not need to be there. Their seal is enough. This can be efficient. It can also be alienating. It suggests the slow birth of an impersonal power, a power that does not argue, does not persuade, does not need to look into anyone's eyes. The system becomes a presence in itself, and where there is an impersonal system, there is always the possibility of manipulation. Not necessarily a grand conspiracy, but the subtle bending of rules by those who understand them. The person who can read the marks has an advantage over the person who cannot. Literacy becomes not only knowledge but leverage. A scribe can interpret quantities, dates, obligations. Interpretation can be honest, or it can be strategic. Even if most scribes are diligent, the very existence of a specialized class that mediates truth through symbols creates a vulnerability. Reality becomes something that can be managed. It is here that the old suspicion about history being rewritten begins to feel less like fantasy and more like a sober observation about institutions. When records are central, those who control records control memory. A society can forget not only through disaster, but through administration. If an archive is curated, certain events are emphasized, others minimized. If a script changes, older documents become difficult to read. If a language shifts, earlier voices fade. Over centuries, even without deliberate erasure, a civilization can become a machine that produces its own official past, smoother and more obedient than the messy truth. The people who live under it inherit that past as if it were the only one. At the same time, it would be too simple to treat records as purely oppressive. Records also allow coordination on a scale that can produce astonishing things. Long-distance trade, complex building projects, specialized crafts, knowledge transmission. A city with records can plan. It can store grain strategically. It can allocate labor. It can survive certain shocks better than a purely informal system. The question is not whether records are good or bad. The question is what they demand in exchange. They demand standardization. They demand compliance. They demand that human life be translated into quantities, categories, and schedules. This translation can seep into the sacred. A temple storehouse uses records to manage offerings. Offerings become regularized. Regular offerings require regular labor. The ritual calendar becomes synchronized with the agricultural calendar. The gods, in a sense, become administrators of time. When a society believes that cosmic order depends on correct rituals, those who manage rituals gain immense authority. The line between spiritual guidance and logistical governance blurs until it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. The sacred becomes the language that makes administration feel meaningful. And still, a deeper discomfort remains. If early writing and record-keeping were crucial triggers, then the first civilizations may have been built on a subtle transformation of human consciousness, the shift from living in a world of relationships to living in a world of abstractions. Abstractions can travel, they can outlast, they can dominate, they can also detach people from the immediate moral weight of their actions. Taking grain from a neighbour feels different than taking grain as a tax, recorded on a tablet. The tablet creates distance. Distance creates justification. Justification creates permanence. Somewhere in this shift, the first civilization becomes not only a physical city, but a mental architecture, an inner acceptance that life can be governed by systems, and that those systems can claim authority greater than any individual's desires. Once that acceptance spreads, cities can multiply, states can expand, empires can dream. Yet the system's fragility does not disappear, records can burn. Seals can be broken, archives can collapse. When that happens, a society may lose not only its memories, but its ability to coordinate at scale. Collapse can then look like a sudden return to silence, a reversion to smaller units, smaller truths. And when later societies rebuild, they may treat the ruins as the first attempt, because earlier attempts have vanished into the missing pages. So the next question does not rest in the clay alone. It rests in the human hunger that clay can serve. Why did people accept the abstraction? Why did they trust marks, measures and offices enough to build their lives around them? Perhaps because the world outside the walls still felt too uncertain, or perhaps because once the machinery of records existed, it began to pull everything toward itself: trade, labor, belief, even violence, until civilization was no longer a choice, but a gravity. And gravity demands a center. The next layer of fog waits where trade routes converge, where standardized weights pass from hand to hand, where strangers become necessary. Because once records exist, exchange can widen. And once exchange widens, the city is no longer merely a survival machine. It becomes a node in a network, tempting, wealthy, exposed, inviting both opportunity and predation from beyond the horizon. A city that becomes a node in a network begins to live with a new kind of anxiety. Not only the fear of famine or flood, but the fear of being cut off. Trade is often described as a sign of sophistication, a widening of horizons, a gentle proof that humans learned cooperation at scale. Yet trade also carries a colder truth. It reveals dependency. It reveals desire. It reveals which materials a region lacks, and which it must obtain through relationships that can turn hostile without warning. In the earlier civilizations, the long-distance movement of goods is not merely commerce. It is a lifeline, and lifelines can become chains. Even in the deepest prehistory, humans carried objects farther than survival strictly required. Obsidian from volcanic sources travelled across landscapes. Shells from coasts appeared inland. Pigments moved between groups. These exchanges hint at social networks older than cities, networks built on trust, ritual gifting, marriage ties, alliances, and shared meanings. But as settlements grew denser and more specialised, exchange began to change shape. It became more regular, more measurable, more essential. A city that contains potters, metalworkers, scribes, builders, priests, guards, and administrators must feed them all. It must provide materials for tools, for construction, for prestige. It must import what it cannot easily produce locally. The network becomes an extension of the city's organs, and once the city relies on that extension, it must protect it, regulate it, and sometimes dominate it. Consider the quiet power of standardized weights and measures. They make exchange smoother, but they also make exchange controllable. If a temple or palace controls the standards, it controls fairness itself. A merchant becomes dependent not only on supply routes, but on the legitimacy granted by institutions. Seals, weights, and records knit trade into administration. A shipment is not fully real until it is documented. A trade agreement is not secure until it is sealed. A foreign partner is not trustworthy until they accept the city's measures and its rules. Civilization spreads not only through conquest but through standards. The subtle way an institution persuades others to align with its definition of value, and value is never neutral. When rare materials move, copper, tin, lapis lazuli, ivory, fine stone, status begins to harden. Prestige goods become visible markers of power. A ruler can distribute them to allies, rewarding loyalty. A temple can display them to demonstrate divine favour. An elite can bury them with the dead, advertising that even death does not dissolve hierarchy. The objects themselves do not create inequality, but they magnify it, making social differences tangible. Once differences are tangible, they become harder to deny, harder to escape. The city becomes a stage where inequality performs itself daily. Trade also brings strangers, and strangers bring information. New techniques, new beliefs, new stories, new diseases, new threats. A city that is connected becomes more resilient in some ways, able to replace shortages through exchange, but also more vulnerable, because its stability depends on distant events beyond its control. A drought hundreds of kilometers away can disrupt a supply line. A conflict between neighbouring groups can close a corridor. A shift in river routes can change which settlements become hubs and which become ghosts. In this sense, early urban life is a wager. Concentrate resources and people in one place, then trust that networks will continue to feed and supply that concentration. This wager helps explain another recurring feature of early civilizations: the building of monuments and centralized structures that look, at first glance, like pure grandeur. Temples, palaces, massive walls, platform mounds. These are not merely aesthetic or religious. They can function as warehouses, redistribution centres, administrative hubs, places where trade goods are stored and reissued, places where labour is organised. Monumentality is often read as pride. It can also be read as anxiety made visible, a society building solid forms to reassure itself that the system will endure. Monuments require coordination. Coordination requires authority. Authority requires legitimacy. Legitimacy often draws on the sacred, on tradition, on claims of cosmic order. Trade goods become offerings. Offerings become proof of divine favour. Divine favour becomes proof of rightful rule. In this loop, the economic and the spiritual are not separate realms. They reinforce each other. A temple might claim that offerings ensure fertility and protection. The practical outcome is that goods concentrate in the temple's control. A palace might claim that tribute ensures security. The practical outcome is that wealth concentrates in the ruler's hands. The city's network of exchange becomes a network of extraction. Here, the old suspicion about history being curated returns with sharper edges. When wealth and prestige flow into institutions, those institutions become gatekeepers of narrative. They fund artisans who depict the world in flattering relief. They sponsor scribes who record victories more eagerly than defeats. They preserve myths that justify rule. They may not need to consciously rewrite history as a coordinated plot. They simply shape what gets recorded and what gets forgotten. Over time, the official past becomes the past of the powerful. The lives of common people, the dissenting voices, the alternate ways of living, these are less likely to be inscribed into durable matter. Yet archaeology sometimes allows glimpses through the cracks. Neighbourhoods that suggest different social strata, evidence of varied diets, tools that hint at labour divisions, burials that show inequality widening. These glimpses imply that early civilization was not a single harmonious project. It was contested ground. Some benefited more than others. Some resented obligations. Some fled. Some resisted quietly. But the system had new tools to handle resistance, ration control, debt enforcement, legal punishment, violence. Trade and administration together provided resources to maintain enforcement. A city that can import metal can arm guards. A city that can store grain can starve dissent into compliance. A city that keeps records can track obligations across generations. This is the uncomfortable turn. The same networks that bring prosperity also enable coercion. If civilization is a machine, trade is part of its fuel, and fuel attracts predators. Not only external raiders, but internal power seekers. A city with wealth becomes a target. It must defend itself, which requires organized violence. Organized violence, once established, rarely remains purely defensive. It tends to expand, to justify itself, to seek new resources. The line between protection and conquest blurs. Walls that keep danger out can also become staging grounds for going out to impose danger elsewhere. There is another layer. Trade creates comparison. When people see foreign goods, they see foreign possibilities. They see that life can be arranged differently. This can produce innovation, but it can also produce insecurity. Elites may intensify displays of power to maintain status. Institutions may tighten control to prevent ideological drift. New religious forms may emerge that unify diverse populations under a single narrative. In a connected world, identity becomes more fragile, and fragile identity often demands stronger symbols. So perhaps one trigger of the first civilizations was not only the internal pressures of climate and agriculture, but the external pull of networks. Once a settlement becomes a hub, it gains advantages that encourage growth. Growth then demands more administration, more infrastructure, more control. The hub becomes a city. The city becomes a state. The state becomes an empire in waiting. And each stage produces more material evidence, which later historians and archaeologists can see more clearly than the quieter lives that preceded it. The visible becomes the official. The official becomes the first. Still, the deeper question remains unresolved. Why did some regions crystallize into full urban systems, while others sustained complex societies without cities for millennia? Trade alone cannot explain the difference. It is a pressure, a temptation, a vulnerability. It accelerates complexity, but it does not always create it. Something else must tip the balance, something that turns a dense settlement into an institution capable of compelling large numbers of people to move in coordinated patterns. That something may be fear in its most practical form, the fear of violence, the fear of losing stored wealth, the fear of being raided, the fear of being cut off. Trade, by making a city richer, may also make it more afraid. And fear has a peculiar creative power. It builds walls, it builds armies, it builds hierarchies, it builds stories that justify obedience. The next layer of fog waits at the edge of that fear, where fortifications rise and weapons appear more often, where skeletons sometimes show signs of trauma, where the city begins to define itself not only by what it produces, but by what it can defend. Because a civilization that cannot protect its surplus is a civilization that invites its own undoing. And protection, once organized, changes everything. Protection, once organized, changes everything because it turns anxiety into structure. A scattered community may fight when it must, but it does not typically maintain violence as a permanent institution. A city does. The moment guards are fed regularly, the moment weapons are stored and issued, the moment walls are repaired not after an attack but in anticipation of one, violence becomes a profession. And a profession requires funding. Funding requires extraction. Extraction requires justification. It is here, in the quiet logic of defense, that early civilization can begin to resemble something more uneasy than a shelter from chaos. It begins to resemble a machine that manufactures necessity. Fortifications in early settlements are among the most sobering pieces of evidence because they are straightforward. A wall is built because someone believes there is danger. A ditch is dug because someone believes there is danger. A gate is controlled because someone believes there is danger. The danger may be neighbours competing for land and water, raiders seeking stored grain, conflicts ignited by old feuds, or opportunistic violence drawn toward wealth. Whatever the cause, the architectural response implies a shift in worldview. Life is no longer organised only around seasons and food, but around threat. The city becomes an answer to threat, and in becoming an answer, it invites threat to define it. The presence of stored surplus intensifies this relationship. Surplus is attractive. It is also visible. A granary is not easily hidden. A herd can be moved, but stored grain sits in place, calling out to hunger and ambition. This is why early urban systems often appear alongside a widening gap between those who have and those who must ask. Inequality itself can generate internal violence, just as external raids do. A city may fear outsiders, but it may also fear the desperation inside its own walls. The more unequal a society becomes, the more it must police itself, and policing is rarely gentle when it is tasked with preserving a fragile order. Defense also changes the balance of authority. When a community faces threat, it often tolerates stronger leadership in exchange for security. Leadership becomes easier to justify when danger is real. Yet once a leadership structure exists, it can keep danger psychologically alive, even when danger subsides. A society organized around defense can become addicted to the clarity of an enemy. The enemy simplifies politics. It makes dissent look like betrayal. It makes extraction look like duty. The walls become not only physical barriers but mental boundaries, dividing the world into inside and outside, us and them, order and chaos. This psychological boundary can reach deep into daily life. It can affect who may enter a city, who may trade, who may marry, who may claim membership. It can influence myths and rituals, shaping gods into protectors, turning kings into guardians of cosmic order. In some traditions, the king is not merely a leader, but the stabilizer of the world, the one who keeps chaos at bay. Such ideas do not need to be fabricated cynically. They can grow naturally in societies that feel the ground shifting beneath them. Yet once they grow, they provide extraordinary leverage. If obedience is framed as protection from chaos, refusing obedience becomes terrifying. Here, The early city's relationship with violence begins to blur into its relationship with identity. A fortress is not only about stopping an attack, it is about declaring a difference. This difference becomes a story. The city is civilized, the outside is wild. The city is orderly, the outside is dangerous. The city has law, the outside has brute force. Such stories become self-fulfilling because they justify expansion. If the outside is dangerous, then bringing it under control can be presented as moral necessity. A defense institution can thus evolve into an expansion institution, and expansion becomes the easiest way to feed the defense institution. Conquest brings tribute. Tribute funds soldiers. Soldiers enable further conquest. The machinery begins to turn. Yet even before empires in the grand sense, small-scale conflict can shape civilization's earliest form. Competition over water is especially potent. Upstream users can deprive downstream fields. A canal breach can be sabotage. A dispute over a boundary stone can become a feud. In such conditions, a city might centralize authority simply to coordinate defense and adjudicate conflicts quickly. But adjudication creates law, and law creates enforcement. Enforcement creates prisons, punishments, social ranking. The need to respond to violence thus expands into broader governance. Archaeological hints of violence sometimes appear in bodies, fractures, embedded projectiles, mass graves, burned settlements. These traces are uneven and difficult to interpret, and they do not offer easy narratives. But they do suggest that the world in which cities emerged was not a peaceful garden. It was a contested landscape, where survival could be threatened not only by weather, but by other humans. In that landscape, the first civilizations may have been less like dawn and more like armor, heavy, restrictive, yet difficult to abandon once worn. This also helps explain why early civilizations often display intense control over labor. Building and maintaining walls, canals, roads, storehouses, and temples requires enormous effort. Voluntary cooperation can achieve a great deal, but sustained large-scale projects often imply organized labor obligations. When violence is an external threat, leaders can claim labor is necessary for defense. When labor is extracted, leaders gain more infrastructure. Infrastructure increases surplus. Surplus increases the stakes of defense. The cycle tightens. The city becomes increasingly dependent on continuous labor, and continuous labor becomes increasingly enforceable when the city can withhold rations or punish dissent. Here, another subtle shift occurs. Time becomes militarized. Not in the sense of constant war, but in the sense of constant readiness. Schedules, rotations, duty assignments. A guard must stand watch at night. A work crew must repair a breach before sunrise. An administrator must distribute rations at a set hour. Civilization becomes a choreography not only of production, but of vigilance. The listener can almost feel the sleeplessness inside the system, even as the narrative itself stays slow and quiet. The city, as an organism, cannot fully relax. It must keep its eyes open. And what does this vigilance do to memory? It tends to simplify it. Under threat, nuance becomes dangerous. Complex truths can be postponed. Stories become sharper, more useful. This is one reason why later civilizations often leave records that praise rulers, exaggerate victories, downplay internal strife. The record becomes a tool for morale as much as administration. Again, this does not require a single controlling faction, rewriting history in secret. It requires a civilization that is always defending itself, always justifying its demands. Such a civilization naturally produces narratives that stabilize obedience. Yet the unease remains because defense is not purely imposed. People often accept it willingly, even eagerly, when the alternative feels like chaos. The first city walls may have been built by hands that believed they were building safety, and perhaps they were. The question is whether the cost of that safety was understood at the time, because once the city becomes the center of life, the countryside becomes peripheral. Once the countryside becomes peripheral, it becomes a resource. Once it becomes a resource, it becomes a domain to be controlled. And control reshapes landscapes and people, sometimes so thoroughly that later generations forget any other arrangement ever existed. So the trigger of civilization might include a simple, brutal insight. Concentration creates vulnerability, and vulnerability demands defense. Defense demands hierarchy. Hierarchy demands ideology. Ideology demands ritual and record. Record demands literacy and bureaucracy. Bureaucracy demands more surplus. Surplus demands more control over land and water. And the chain continues, each link reinforcing the next. The next layer of fog waits not at the wall itself, but inside the city, where the presence of defense institutions and administrative systems begins to produce a visible stratification of human life. If violence and protection helped create authority, then authority will leave marks on the dead as well as the living. And the dead, in their silence, often reveal what the living preferred not to say aloud: who mattered, who served, who owned, who was owned, and when inequality stopped being temporary and became inherited. The dead do not argue, and that is why they can be so unsettling. A city can be described in proud inscriptions, celebrated in myths, praised in later histories. But burials, especially when they become unequal, tell a quieter truth. They show who was fed well, who wore rare materials, who was surrounded by symbols of status even in death, and who disappeared with little more than a handful of earth. When early civilizations are studied through their graves, the story of progress begins to feel less like a rising staircase and more like a narrowing corridor, where some people walked comfortably and others were pressed against the walls. Inequality is not unique to civilizations. Human groups can always develop status differences, charismatic leaders, respected elders, skilled specialists. But in small societies, inequality is often limited by proximity. Everyone sees everyone. Resources are difficult to hoard. Social pressure can restrain excess. In cities, distance grows. Not only physical distance, but social distance. The elite can live behind walls within walls. They can eat differently, dress differently, marry within their class, store wealth in forms that do not spoil. Institutions can protect them. Records can legitimize their claims. Violence can enforce their privileges. Inequality can become structural, and once it becomes structural, it begins to feel natural to those who benefit from it. The archaeological signs can be subtle, but they accumulate. Variation in grave goods, differences in housing size and construction, unequal access to exotic materials, evidence of differential diets, where certain people consume more meat or better grains. These patterns suggest that the trigger of civilization may not be a single event, but a shift in social mathematics. The moment when surplus and administration allowed some individuals or groups to consistently take more than others and to defend that taking as rightful. Civilization, from this angle, becomes a technology for making inequality stable. Stability requires inheritance. It is one thing for a powerful leader to emerge in a crisis. It is another for power to become a family property. Yet in many early state systems, leadership roles harden into dynasties. The reasons are practical at first. A ruling household holds knowledge of administration, foreign alliances, ritual responsibilities. They become a familiar anchor. In unstable environments, familiarity feels like safety. But familiarity also creates a narrative of legitimacy. Children of rulers are raised to rule. Rulers claim divine ancestry. Genealogies become sacred. The state becomes not only a machine, but a lineage, and the lineage becomes the face of the machine. This is where the sacred returns with a different texture. Earlier, rituals could synchronize communities and stabilize cooperation. Now, a ritual can also sanctify inequality. A temple might declare that the gods chose certain families. A king might be presented as the mediator between humans and cosmic order. Priests might become the interpreters of divine will, and their interpretations often align conveniently with existing hierarchies. The result is not always cynical. Human beings genuinely seek meaning. Yet meaning, once institutionalized, can become a fence. It can make resistance feel like sacrilege. It can make suffering feel like destiny. Inequality also shapes labor in a way that is both mundane and profound. Someone must build the walls, maintain the canals, harvest the grain, carry the bricks, dig the ditches, haul the stones. In early civilizations, much of this work is done by commoners, sometimes under obligation systems that resemble taxation in labor form. In some cases, captive labor or forms of slavery appear, people whose bodies become resources owned by others. Even where slavery is not the dominant model, coerced labor exists along a spectrum: debt bondage, corvée labor, servitude tied to land. These arrangements do not emerge because humans suddenly became cruel. They emerge because the city's machine demands steady inputs. Labor is the most reliable input when nature is unreliable. The existence of debt, already hinted at through grain storage systems, becomes especially potent here. Debt can transform a temporary hardship into a long-term loss of freedom. A failed harvest forces a family to borrow grain. Borrowing requires repayment with interest. Interest can become impossible. The debtor offers labor, then offers land, then offers their children's labor. Over time, debt becomes a quiet engine of stratification. It creates a class of people who owe and a class of people who are owed. It makes inequality reproduce itself without open violence, because the violence is encoded in obligation. Records amplify this. A debt recorded on clay survives the death of the debtor. It can be inherited, transferred, enforced. In this way, writing does not only remember, it binds. A society that relies on written obligations can maintain hierarchy more efficiently. It can expand authority beyond face-to-face control. It can standardize extraction. The state becomes a persistent creditor, and the people become, in effect, a resource base. This may be one reason why early civilizations often produce complex legal codes and administrative categories. Such systems can provide protections, but they can also define who is protected and who is not. A law that sets penalties for theft protects property owners. A law that regulates labor can protect elites from disruption. Once law exists, it can be presented as impartial, even when it quietly favors certain classes. The rhetoric of order can mask the mechanics of inequality, and yet the story is not simply one of oppression. Early urban life also offers opportunities that can be rare in smaller societies. Specialization, access to goods, participation in large rituals, communal identity, shared protection. Some people may have preferred it, despite the costs. This complexity matters because it suggests that civilization's trigger was not only coercion but attraction. The city could be a magnet. It could offer stability, markets, marriage options, social mobility for a few. The very presence of monumental architecture and shared rituals could create awe, a sense of belonging to something larger than the self. Awe can make hardship bearable. Awe can also make hierarchy feel meaningful. Still, the question remains: when did inequality become so embedded that it could survive even when systems faltered? Because early civilizations did falter, repeatedly. Droughts, floods, invasions, internal conflicts. When collapse comes, elites sometimes fall, but the patterns of inequality can persist in new forms. The habit of hierarchy can outlive the institutions that first produced it. Once people have lived under kings, they may rebuild kings after ruin, because the model of order has become familiar. The imagination of alternative arrangements can weaken over generations. This brings the narrative back to the uneasy possibility of restart, of multiple beginnings. If civilizations collapse and rebuild, then the first civilization may be less a singular birth than a series of births, each learning from the last, each inheriting fragments of administrative knowledge, ritual structures, and social stratification. Some knowledge is carried forward, Some is lost. The lost knowledge becomes the gap that later historians struggle to fill. It becomes the whisper that perhaps the story has been simplified, not necessarily by an intentional conspirator, but by the physics of survival and the fragility of record. And so the next layer of fog waits in a place that is both intimate and vast. In the moments when belief systems become infrastructure, not only sanctifying inequality, but organizing daily life through temples, priests, and cosmologies that can coordinate thousands. If inequality is one pillar of civilization, belief may be another, because belief can turn compliance into devotion, and devotion can power the machinery more reliably than fear alone. When belief becomes infrastructure, it changes the texture of obedience. Fear can force people to comply, but fear is exhausting. It demands constant pressure, constant punishment, constant vigilance. Belief is quieter. Belief can make compliance feel voluntary, even beautiful. It can turn labor into offering, taxes into tribute, hierarchy into cosmic arrangement. And in the earliest civilizations, temples often stand not only as places of worship, but as thick knots where economy, authority, and meaning tie themselves together so tightly that separating them becomes almost impossible. A temple can begin as a shared sacred space, somewhere people gather to mark seasons, mourn, celebrate, ask for protection. But once a settlement grows, the temple can also become a storehouse, because sacred spaces are trusted spaces. Offerings accumulate. Offerings must be managed. Management requires record keeping. Record keeping requires specialists. Specialists require support. Support comes from redistributed grain and goods. A cycle forms in which the sacred does not hover above practical life, but sits in its centre, quietly claiming that the centre must be fed. This does not mean early religion was invented as a tool of control. Humans have always sought patterns, comfort, and explanation. In unstable climates, when flood and drought decide survival, the urge to negotiate with the unseen can feel as practical as digging a canal. Ritual can provide psychological stability. It can reduce conflict by giving people shared rhythms. It can make the unpredictable feel at least interpretable. Yet the very usefulness of ritual makes it attractive to institutions. A priesthood that claims knowledge of omens and calendars becomes indispensable. Indispensable roles gain privilege. Privilege hardens. Over time, the sacred can become a ladder with a narrow top. The sky itself becomes part of this ladder. Early civilizations often devote enormous attention to celestial cycles. Sun, moon, stars, planets. Because these cycles offer something rivers do not: regularity. The heavens keep time with a steadiness that can feel like a promise. If a society can align planting and harvest with celestial markers, it can reduce risk. If it can predict seasonal shifts, it can plan labour. The problem is that this predictive knowledge can be monopolized. Those who can read the sky can claim authority over time, and time, in an agricultural civilization, is everything. Control of the calendar becomes control of collective behaviour. When festivals occur, when taxes are due, when labour is drafted, when marriages are permitted, when debts are forgiven or enforced. Once the calendar is sacred, it becomes harder to challenge. A ruler who demands labour can say it is required by the season's ritual. A temple that collects offerings can say it maintains cosmic balance. A drought can be interpreted as a sign that offerings were insufficient or that moral order was violated, interpretations that often lead conveniently to more extraction and stricter discipline. In this way, belief does not merely comfort the anxious, it can intensify anxiety in ways that keep people bound to the institution that promises relief. And there is another dimension, more subtle and more intimate. Cities bring strangers together. Strangers need shared identity. Shared identity can be manufactured through symbols, gods, myths, origin stories, public rituals. A myth can tell a diverse population that they belong to the same cosmic household. A ritual can synchronize bodies in the same movement, the same chant, the same silence. In doing so, belief becomes a tool for scaling community beyond the limits of kinship. Civilization, in this view, might be triggered partly by the need for social glue, strong enough to bind large numbers of unrelated people into cooperative patterns, but glue can also restrain. A shared myth often defines who belongs and who does not. It can draw moral boundaries around outsiders. It can justify conquest as divine mandate. It can present the city's expansion as the spread of cosmic order. Here, belief becomes not only internal infrastructure but external weapon, soft power that can harden into violence. A civilization that believes it embodies order can treat others as chaos, and chaos can be subdued without guilt. Temples and priesthoods can also function as early centres of literacy. Where writing exists, it often appears first in administrative and sacred contexts. The ability to read and write becomes associated with power, both practical and spiritual. Texts can encode laws, rituals, genealogies, property claims, cosmological narratives. When such texts are preserved within temple institutions, the temple becomes a gatekeeper of memory. It holds the official past. It decides which stories are repeated, which lineages are honoured, which deviations are condemned. Over generations, this curatorial role can create the impression that the temple's narrative is simply what happened, when it is also, inevitably, a selection. This is where the idea of history being controlled begins to feel less like a dramatic conspiracy and more like a structural feature of early states. Institutions that preserve writing have disproportionate influence over what survives. If a rival cult is suppressed, its texts may be destroyed. If a dynasty falls, its inscriptions may be defaced. If a language shifts, older texts become unreadable to common people. Memory narrows. The official story remains. The gaps widen. It is important, though, to avoid turning this into a simple tale of priests manipulating the masses. Many priests likely believed deeply in their roles. Many rituals likely provided real cohesion and comfort. Many myths preserved ecological knowledge encoded in symbolic form. The sacred can contain truth that is not easily expressed in numbers. Yet even sincere belief can serve power. A system does not need cynical intent to produce hierarchical outcomes. It needs only to reward certain roles and punish others. The physical layout of early cities sometimes mirrors this. Temples occupy central spaces, elevated platforms, highly visible locations. Processional routes channel crowds. Public squares allow rituals to gather masses. Architecture becomes choreography. The body learns where to walk, where to bow, where to stand in relation to authority. Over time, the city teaches its inhabitants how to feel about themselves, small in the presence of the sacred, dependent on institutions that claim to mediate between humans and the forces that decide harvest and flood. Belief also provides a language for suffering. In early urban life, suffering is common: disease, hard labour, inequality, unpredictable weather, violence. If suffering is framed as random, people may blame leaders. If suffering is framed as part of cosmic order, people may endure. Endurance is a resource for a state. A population that can endure without revolt is a stable labour base. In this sense, the sacred can function as a technology of resilience. It keeps the machine running through hardship. It also makes the machine harder to dismantle, because dismantling would feel like dismantling the universe's order. And yet, belief does not always stabilize. It can fracture. Competing cults can compete for offerings. Different interpretations of omens can undermine legitimacy. A drought interpreted as divine anger can destabilize rulers. In such moments, the sacred becomes political dynamite. Civilizations can wobble not only from climate and war, but from spiritual crisis, when the stories that justify hierarchy stop convincing. This fragility hints at a deeper trigger. Civilizations may have emerged not only because humans learned to control resources, but because they learned to construct shared realities. symbolic worlds capable of organizing thousands. Shared reality is powerful. It can coordinate labor, enforce debts, justify rulers, calm fear, and create identity. But it also creates a new vulnerability. If shared reality breaks, the system can collapse even if resources remain. The machine requires belief as fuel. So the next layer of fog waits where belief and violence intersect most clearly, in the ruler's claim to legitimacy. If temples provide cosmic justification, rulers provide enforcement. When these two align, civilization becomes unusually durable. When they diverge, it becomes brittle. The question becomes, how did early rulers persuade people that authority was not merely convenient but rightful? So rightful that it could be inherited, defended, and imposed even when the world itself seemed to protest. A ruler does not become rightful merely by being strong. Strength can seize power, but it struggles to make power feel inevitable. Inevitability requires a story, one that can settle into a population's bones, so that obedience feels less like surrender and more like the way things have always been. In early civilizations, legitimacy often grows at the intersection of ritual and force, where the temple's cosmic language and the state's practical demands learn to speak with one voice. When that voice becomes familiar, it begins to sound like truth. The earliest rulers may have emerged from real needs, coordinating irrigation, settling disputes, organizing defense, managing trade. In moments of crisis, communities often tolerate concentrated authority because coordination can mean survival. But crisis authority is not the same as permanent rule. The step from one to the other is delicate. It depends on memory, on fear, on institutional habits, and on how effectively leaders convert temporary necessity into lasting structure. One of the most effective tools for this conversion is the control of redistribution. When a ruler, or a palace, or a temple state, controls grain stores and rationing, it controls the population's relationship with hunger. In a world where harvests can fail, this is a profound leverage. Rations can reward loyalty, punish dissent, stabilize labor forces. Over time, people do not only fear the sword, they fear exclusion from the system that feeds them. The ruler becomes associated not only with coercion but with survival itself. The palace becomes a kind of weather, something that determines comfort or hardship. This can be dressed in sacred language. The ruler is blessed by the gods, chosen to ensure fertility, responsible for maintaining cosmic balance. If crops fail, the ruler may perform rituals, offer sacrifices, build monuments, or intensify obligations, presenting these actions as necessary repairs to the universe's order. The ruler becomes not merely an administrator, but a cosmic technician, a caretaker of the boundary between order and chaos. Such ideas can sound mythic in modern ears, yet in a world where nature is unpredictable and institutions promise stability, the myth and the practical can feel inseparable. Writing deepens this inseparability. A ruler who is recorded becomes more real than a ruler remembered only in stories. Inscriptions proclaim victories, build reputations that can outlast death, and define the past in ways that support the present. Genealogies inscribed into durable material do not merely describe ancestry. They manufacture legitimacy. A dynasty becomes a chain, and chains feel stronger than individuals. Even if the chain is occasionally broken by upheaval, the idea of the chain can survive because it offers an appealing illusion: continuity. Continuity is seductive in unstable times. If climate shifts, if floods fail, if enemies raid, continuity feels like protection. A ruler can present themselves as the anchor that prevents the world from dissolving into uncertainty. In doing so, rulers often emphasize rituals that link the state to deep time, founding myths, divine mandates, sacred lineages. The people are invited to see themselves as part of a cosmic story that began long before they were born and will continue long after. This invitation can be comforting. It can also be binding. Leaving the system can feel like leaving the story of existence itself. Yet legitimacy is never only about myth. It is also about performance. Public rituals, monumental architecture, processions, ceremonies of justice. These are theatres where authority becomes visible and thus believable. A ruler who appears regularly in ritual contexts does not merely display power, they normalise it. The body learns the choreography of deference, where to stand, when to bow, when to be silent. Over time, such choreography becomes instinct. Civilization's trigger here may include the discovery that repeated performance can turn an arrangement into an internalized habit. Monuments intensify this internalization. A massive temple, a palace platform, a city wall. These are not just structures. They are arguments made of stone and mud brick. They claim that the order they represent is too large to be questioned. They dwarf the individual. They suggest permanence. A person might doubt a ruler's character, but it is harder to doubt a wall that has stood for generations. The wall becomes a teacher, whispering that the state is older than any complaint. Still, legitimacy has opponents. Famine, injustice, humiliation, disease, defeat. When these strike, rulers must explain them. This is where scapegoating can emerge, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently. A social group is blamed for divine anger. A rival cult is accused of impurity. A neighbouring people is presented as a threat to cosmic order. In such explanations, legitimacy is protected by directing anger away from the institution itself. This pattern does not require a hidden council plotting in darkness. It is an almost automatic reflex in hierarchical systems. Preserve the centre by sacrificing the margins. Over time, the state's story becomes entangled with what later scholars call civilization itself. Writing, law, monumental architecture, standardized weights, organized labour, these become markers of being advanced. Those who live outside the state, or who resist it, are labelled backward, chaotic, or uncivilized. This labelling is not merely insulting, it is political. It justifies expansion and suppression. It also shapes what survives in the historical record. States write. Non-states often do not, or their writings are less likely to be preserved. The result is a skewed mirror. The past appears dominated by states because states leave more visible traces, while alternative ways of living fade into the silence between ruins. This silence can feel like evidence of concealment. Sometimes it is. Archives can be destroyed intentionally. Texts can be censored. Monuments can be defaced. But often, silence is produced by simpler forces: fragility, accident, the selective preservation of durable materials, and the priorities of institutions that chose what to copy and what to discard. Still, the effect is similar. The official story survives. The unofficial story becomes speculation, whispered at the edges, tempting the mind to imagine what was removed. Legitimacy also shapes knowledge itself. When temples and palaces sponsor specialists, astronomers, builders, healers, knowledge can flourish, but it may also be guided towards state needs. Astronomy becomes calendar management. Mathematics becomes accounting. Medicine becomes maintaining labour forces. Engineering becomes building walls and canals. Knowledge that serves power is funded. Knowledge that challenges it is marginalised. Over centuries, the very structure of what a civilization knows can become a reflection of what it needs to control. And yet, even with legitimacy, civilizations remain precarious. A drought does not respect divine mandate. A river can shift regardless of ritual. A trade network can collapse despite law. When the system fails, legitimacy cracks, and people can abandon cities quickly, leaving behind ruins that later look like sudden mysteries. The gap between before and after widens. Rebuilders inherit fragments, sometimes misunderstanding them, sometimes mythologizing them. The impression of a sudden beginning or a sudden collapse may be in part an illusion created by discontinuity. This returns the narrative to the original unease. Perhaps the first civilizations were not triggered by a single discovery but by a convergence. Climate pressure demanding storage and coordination, grain enabling surplus and debt, irrigation binding communities into labour systems, records making obligations durable, trade widening dependency and wealth, violence demanding organised protection, belief providing social glue, legitimacy turning these arrangements into tradition. In such a convergence, the emergence of civilization may feel sudden, not because it truly was, but because once the system crosses a threshold, it becomes visible in durable traces. The next layer of fog waits in the moments when these systems fail, when cities empty, when monuments are abandoned, when records stop being written. If civilization is triggered by pressures that create complex structures, then what triggers its disappearance? And if disappearance is common, then how many beginnings were erased before the beginnings that survived were later labelled the first? If disappearance is common, then the ruins are not merely endings, they are filters. They decide which beginnings will be remembered and which will be swallowed. The earliest civilizations are often presented like sturdy foundations, but the ground beneath them was restless. Cities emptied, regions contracted, networks snapped, languages died. People walked away from streets their ancestors had built, leaving behind walls that would stand long enough to mislead future minds into thinking permanence had been achieved. The question becomes less romantic and more troubling. If civilization is such an effective solution, why does it fail so often? And what does failure do to the story of how it began? Collapse is a word that sounds dramatic, but it often arrives quietly. A canal silts up. A river changes course. Salts accumulate in the soil. A trade route becomes unsafe. A drought lasts longer than expected. A disease spreads through dense neighbourhoods. A political feud fractures coordination. None of these are single apocalyptic blows. They are slow erosions, the steady grinding of limits against systems built to outpace limits. Early states are especially vulnerable because they concentrate people and dependence. When a city's food supply falters, there are fewer alternatives. When a city's water system fails, there is nowhere to run inside the walls. Disease is one of the most intimate pressures, and one of the least visible in many ancient narratives. Dense living brings waste problems, contaminated water, and close contact with animals. Pathogens thrive. A population can endure poor harvests if stored grain exists, but epidemics strike differently. They reduce labour, they weaken defence, they undermine confidence in rulers and rituals. They can turn the city's promise of stability into a nightmare of contagion. Archaeological traces of disease can be subtle. Bone lesions, mass burials, shifts in settlement patterns, but the logic is clear. The city is an ecological experiment, and experiments do not always go well. Environmental limits can be even colder. Irrigation increases yields, but it can also degrade soil. Deforestation for fuel and construction can alter local climates and increase erosion. Intensive agriculture can exhaust land. These processes are slow enough that people may not notice until decline is advanced. When yields fall, elites often intensify extraction to maintain their lifestyles and institutions. This creates resentment. Resentment can become rebellion. Rebellion can become violence. Violence can destroy infrastructure. Infrastructure failure can deepen food shortage. The system enters a spiral where each attempt to preserve order accelerates disorder. Trade networks, once lifelines, can become points of fragility. A city that depends on imported materials, metal, stone, timber, can be crippled if routes close. Conflict, piracy, political shifts, or distant ecological change can disrupt exchange. Once disrupted, specialized crafts suffer. Economic inequality sharpens. Administrative systems strain. A city's complexity becomes its weakness, because complexity is expensive to maintain. When resources shrink, the first things to fail are often the most sophisticated. bureaucracies, monumental building programs, long-distance trade, people retreat into smaller, more flexible arrangements. The urban machine sheds parts until it can no longer function as a city. In such moments, the record often goes silent. Writing, especially if concentrated in temples and palaces, can disappear quickly when institutions collapse. A burned archive does not only lose information, it can sever continuity. Future generations may inherit ruins without understanding their meaning. They may occupy the land without the old administrative knowledge. They may preserve fragments of myth, but lose the practical details of governance. Over time, these fragments can be reshaped into legend, and legend can mislead. The first civilization becomes the first that left enough readable traces to re-enter history, not necessarily the first that ever existed. This is where the idea of reset gains its unsettling resonance. A reset does not require a single catastrophic global event, though such events can occur. A reset can be regional, cultural, institutional. It can be the loss of writing in one area. It can be the abandonment of cities in another. It can be the reorganization of society after conquest. From the perspective of a later historian, these resets create gaps that look like mysteries. They invite speculation. Was knowledge deliberately suppressed? Did a powerful institution erase inconvenient memories? Was there a forgotten high culture that vanished without trace? Sometimes the answer may involve deliberate destruction. Conquerors have incentives to dismantle rival legitimacy. Temples can be looted, inscriptions defaced, libraries burned, myths rewritten to favour new rulers. Yet it would be misleading to imagine a single, continuous hidden hand orchestrating erasure across millennia. More often, erasure is opportunistic and local, combined with the brutal fragility of ancient materials. Clay tablets survive when baked accidentally in fires. Papyrus and parchment often do not. Wood rots, ink fades. The past is preserved not only by intention but by accident, and accidents shape what feels true to later minds. The psychological effect of collapse can also matter. Communities that have suffered through famine, war, disease, or political failure may lose faith in complex systems. They may distrust centralized authority. They may favor mobility, smaller settlements, or simpler social structures. Even if urban life returns later, it may return differently, with new myths explaining why the previous order fell. The memory of collapse becomes part of cultural caution, a shadow at the edge of ambition. Yet as generations pass, caution fades. The cycle can repeat. This repetition complicates the question of triggers. If civilizations rise and fall, then what triggers their rise may also plant the seeds of their fall. Centralization increases efficiency but decreases resilience. Surplus enables specialization but creates targets for raiders and rulers. Records stabilize obligations but can ossify inequality and resentment. Monumentality inspires unity but demands labor and resources. Belief provides cohesion but can fracture under spiritual crisis. Defense protects but can become predatory. The trigger is not a single cause, it is a configuration, and configurations are unstable. There is another unsettling detail. In some regions, collapse is not complete. Instead, it is transformation. A city might shrink, but rural life continues. Institutions change, but cultural elements persist. Languages evolve rather than vanish. Yet from a distance of thousands of years, transformation can look like disappearance, because the material style changes, the script changes, the urban footprint contracts. The historian sees discontinuity. The people who lived it experience adaptation. The gap between lived reality and archaeological visibility becomes another source of mystery. So the question begins to turn in a new direction. If the story of first civilizations is shaped by what survives, then the triggers we identify may be shaped by survival bias. We focus on rivers because river civilizations left durable mud brick and clay tablets. We focus on monumental architecture because stone persists. We focus on writing because writing can be dated. But what about civilizations that built in wood, or recorded in perishable materials, or organized complexity without monuments? Their traces may be thinner, their presence harder to prove, their beginnings easier to deny. The fog thickens not because nothing happened, but because evidence is uneven. This is why the earliest known cities can feel suspiciously complete. They appear with walls, temples, records, trade. But perhaps they are not the first steps. Perhaps they are the steps that remained visible after earlier experiments were erased by collapse, sea level rise, sediment, or the slow digestion of time. The first civilization might be the first that endured long enough to leave a clear footprint in the archaeological record, not the first that ever tried. The next layer of fog waits at sites that blur categories, places that look like organized ritual or dense settlement before full agriculture, places that complicate linear narratives. Because if there were earlier experiments, their traces may survive at the margins of our definitions, in unexpected monuments, in strange symbolic complexes, in settlements that do not fit the neat sequence. Those edges may hold hints of how civilization truly began, or how many times it began and was forced to begin again. Edges are where the neat story grows thin, when a narrative insists that farming comes first, then villages, then cities, then states. The edges begin to look like errors, awkward exceptions to be explained away. Yet sometimes the edges are not errors. Sometimes they are the shape of the truth, showing that human history did not move like a straight line, but like a river, branching, looping, vanishing underground, reappearing elsewhere. If the earliest civilizations look suspiciously complete, perhaps it is because earlier experiments linger at the margins, half visible, refusing to be filed neatly into the categories that later institutions prefer. There are places that seem to whisper this refusal, sites where people gathered with a purpose larger than daily survival, before agriculture fully stabilized. Places where monumental effort appears without clear evidence of kings or palaces. Places where symbolism feels organized, persistent, and shared across groups. Such sites do not prove a hidden lost empire, but they do unsettle the tidy sequence. They suggest that complex social organization, ritual coordination, long-term planning, shared mythic frameworks may have existed before or alongside the full agricultural state machine. If so, then the trigger for civilization might include something more elusive than grain and canals, the human capacity to gather around meaning. Meaning can be more practical than it sounds. A large ritual center can function as a meeting point for dispersed groups. It can stabilize alliances, marriages, trade, conflict resolution. It can coordinate seasonal movement. It can create shared identity across distance. These are all survival functions, even if expressed through symbolism. In a landscape where resources fluctuate, seasonal gatherings can help communities share information, where herds moved, where rains fell, which paths are dangerous. Over generations, such gatherings can create obligations and hierarchies that later solidify into permanent structures. In this view, the sacred does not arrive after the economic. The sacred can be the framework that makes large-scale economic coordination possible. This idea has an unsettling implication. If shared ritual and symbolic coordination can exist without cities, then cities are not the only path to complexity. Civilization, as commonly defined, may be a particular crystallization of complexity rather than complexity itself. It may be what happens when symbolic coordination, economic surplus, environmental pressure, and the technologies of record-keeping converge strongly enough to produce permanence. The first civilizations would then be the first crystallizations that remained visible long enough to be studied. The margins also include settlements that are dense but do not show obvious signs of centralized kingship, at least not in the monumental style that later empires preferred. Dense housing, shared spaces, evidence of craft specialization and ritual behavior, yet no towering palaces, no grand royal tombs. This suggests that early complex living could be negotiated in multiple ways. Some societies may have maintained relative egalitarianism longer, others may have centralized quickly. The triggers might be similar: population, environment, surplus, but the outcomes differ depending on cultural choices, local ecology, and historical accidents. Historical accidents matter more than comforting narratives admit. A river shifts course, and one settlement becomes a hub while another becomes a ruin. A drought hits during a political transition, and an institution collapses that might have endured otherwise. A trade corridor opens, and a village becomes wealthy enough to attract both artisans and raiders. A disease strikes and reshapes demography, altering labour dynamics and social bargaining power. These accidents can determine which experiments become the templates that later societies inherit. The template then gets mistaken for the inevitable path. The margins also include submerged worlds. Sea levels rose significantly after the last ice age, swallowing coastal plains that would have been rich in resources and attractive for early settlement. If early complex communities existed along now submerged coastlines, much of their evidence may lie underwater, harder to excavate, easier to ignore. This does not mean there were underwater empires. It means the map of early human life has missing coastline pages. The visible story is shaped by what remains above water and within reach of research. In that sense, civilization may appear to begin inland not because it truly did, but because inland evidence survived. When evidence is uneven, institutions can become tempted to overconfidently simplify. Textbooks prefer clean sequences. National narratives prefer clear origins. Museums prefer artifacts that can be displayed and labelled. Complex, ambiguous sites challenge these preferences. They demand that uncertainty be acknowledged, and uncertainty is uncomfortable. It is easier to say, civilization began here, at this date, with this invention, than to admit that beginnings may be plural, overlapping, and partially erased. This is where the idea of later control over history returns, but in a quieter, more structural form. Even without a single secretive force rewriting the past can be shaped by what later systems choose to emphasize. An empire may celebrate urban founders and ignore mobile peoples. A religious institution may preserve texts that support its worldview and neglect those that complicate it. A modern academic tradition may privilege writing as the marker of civilization, and thus undervalue complex societies that express knowledge differently. These biases are not conspiracies, they're currents. But currents can still carry certain stories to the surface and leave others at the bottom. The trigger question, then, becomes tangled with another question: triggered to appear to whom? Civilizations may have appeared in the sense that they became visible and legible to later observers when they adopted durable materials and record systems that survive. But human complexity existed before that visibility. The earliest urban states are not the first human achievements, they are the first to leave behind a particular kind of footprint, one that can be dated, categorized, and turned into a narrative. And yet, there is something genuinely transformative about the emergence of full urban systems. Once writing, bureaucracy, centralized storage, organized violence and ideology align, a society can scale rapidly. It can project power. It can produce enduring monuments and long legal traditions. It can accumulate knowledge in archives. It can also concentrate risk and suffering. The machine, once assembled, changes the planet and the human mind. The question is whether this assembly was triggered by a single decisive cause, or by the gradual knitting together of elements that already existed in partial forms at the margins. The margins hint that humans practiced the components of civilization before civilization itself became a recognizable package. They gathered in ritual centers, they traded over long distances, they planned seasonal labor, They built shared identities. They created symbols that outlasted individuals. The trigger might be the moment these components stopped being occasional and became permanent, when gatherings became cities, when ritual calendars became administrative calendars, when exchange became dependency, when stories became law. The next layer of fog waits in the contested places where archaeology, myth, and academic debate intersect, where some scholars argue for earlier or alternative pathways, and others caution against stretching evidence beyond what it can bear. In those debates, the listener can feel the tension between the desire for a clean origin story and the stubborn complexity of the past. The question becomes, when the official sequence begins to wobble, what kinds of evidence are allowed to reshape it, and what kinds are quietly pushed back into the mist? When the official sequence wobbles, the wobble itself becomes a kind of evidence, not of a hidden civilization necessarily, but of a human need to tidy what resists tidying. The past is not only a collection of facts, it is a battleground of interpretations. Archaeology can reveal stone tools, bones, mud brick walls, pollen trapped in ancient sediment. But interpretation is where pressure enters, the pressure of funding, of national pride, of academic consensus, of reputational risk. And in that pressure, certain possibilities feel safer than others. Some are encouraged, others are quietly placed behind caution tape. This is not an accusation. It is an observation about institutions. Institutions survive by being legible. They reward arguments that can be defended within accepted frameworks. They distrust leaps, even when the leap is tempting. When a site appears to complicate established sequences, when it suggests early monumentality, early complexity, or unexpected discontinuity, scholars often respond with careful language. They must. Evidence can be fragile, dating can be uncertain, context can be disturbed. Yet the careful language can also become a wall that keeps the public from feeling how strange the data sometimes is. The strangeness gets smoothed into acceptable phrasing, and the listener, far from the trench and the lab, is left with a story that sounds more confident than the ground beneath it. At the same time, the public hunger for mystery can swing too far in the other direction. When the official story feels too neat, alternative narratives rush in. Lost continents, forgotten empires, advanced technologies erased by catastrophe. Some of these narratives are imaginative but ungrounded. They can distort real complexities into spectacle. Yet their popularity can itself be a clue. People sense gaps. They sense missing steps. They sense that the past has been edited, even if the editing is often done by time, not by secret hands. The public's suspicion is not always accurate in detail, but it often emerges from a real discomfort, a feeling that the origin story is too simple for the human animal. In the academic world, debates over early civilization triggers often revolve around how much weight to give different kinds of evidence. Environmental explanations emphasize climate shifts, resource stress, carrying capacity. Social explanations emphasize competition, cooperation, inequality, prestige, leadership. Symbolic explanations emphasize ritual, shared identity, cognitive frameworks. Each lens catches something true. Each lens also risks becoming a total explanation. The wobble appears when no single lens can carry the full weight. Civilization seems to require multiple pressures aligning, and when multiple pressures align, causality becomes hard to narrate cleanly. There is also the matter of dating itself, the quiet authority of numbers, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, typology. These methods are powerful, but they are not omniscient. Materials can be contaminated, layers can be mixed, sites can be reused over millennia, compressing time into a confusing stack. A single misinterpreted context can shift an entire timeline. Scholars know this. That is why disputes can become intense. It is not only about facts, it is about which facts can be trusted enough to rearrange the story. And because rearranging the story carries consequences. If civilization began differently than assumed, if ritual coordination preceded agriculture more strongly, if coastal settlements now submerged played a larger role, if early urbanism took more diverse forms, then long-held narratives about progress, state formation, and human nature must shift. These narratives are not neutral. They shape modern identity. They shape political claims. They shape how societies justify authority. The origin story of civilization is often used as an origin story of legitimacy. States are natural, hierarchy is inevitable, centralization is progress. If the past is more varied, then the present may be more negotiable than institutions prefer to admit. This is where the quiet possibility of control enters, not as a melodramatic conspiracy, but as a tendency. Systems of knowledge, like states, can drift toward preserving their own stability. Certain frameworks become standard, and standard frameworks attract funding, publications, careers. Challenges to the framework must be exceptionally well supported to succeed. This protects against nonsense, which is good. But it can also slow the acceptance of genuine complexity. Sometimes the resistance is rational caution. Sometimes it is inertia. Sometimes it is a subtle defense of identity. It is easier to critique data than to revise a worldview. In this environment, controversial hypotheses can flourish at the edges. Some are carefully argued and remain debated. Others are sensational. The difficulty for an honest listener is that both kinds often use similar language: gaps, suppression, lost knowledge. The difference is not in the mood, but in the discipline. A careful hypothesis anchors itself in published evidence and acknowledges uncertainty. A sensational one treats uncertainty as proof, yet the existence of uncertainty is real, and it keeps the fog alive. The trigger question becomes almost philosophical here. Humans ask for a single trigger because single triggers are comforting. They imply causality that can be mastered. But the past may not offer that comfort. Civilizations may have emerged when multiple stressors and opportunities crossed thresholds. Climate variability, resource density, population growth, social competition, ritual cohesion, trade networks, administrative technologies, organized protection. None alone is sufficient. Together they can produce a tipping point. A village becomes a city not when one invention appears, but when the cost of staying small becomes greater than the cost of becoming organized. Still, a listener may feel the presence of something else, something harder to quantify, a change in human self-conception. The moment people begin to see themselves as citizens rather than kin. The moment they accept that rules can come from an institution rather than from relationships. The moment they allow a record to outrank a memory. The moment they believe that order is not only desirable but sacred. These are cognitive and cultural thresholds, and they can spread like contagion through networks of trade and migration. If such thresholds are real, then the emergence of civilization is not only ecological or economic, it is psychological. It is a shift in how humans relate to time, to land, to obligation, to authority. Once the shift occurs, it can propagate. Neighbouring groups can adopt urban models to compete, to defend, to trade. Civilization can become contagious, not because it is always better, but because it changes the game. In a world where one region centralizes power, surrounding regions may be forced to respond, either by adopting similar structures or by becoming targets. This contagion complicates the notion of first. The first civilization may have appeared in one place, but the appearance elsewhere may not require the same triggers. It may require only exposure and pressure. A community may urbanize not because its environment demands it, but because neighbouring states threaten it. The trigger becomes geopolitical. The city becomes a defensive mimicry, an adaptation to a new human predator, organised power. The next layer of fog waits in the paradox this creates. If civilization spreads because it changes the game, then it may not always be chosen freely. It may be adopted under pressure, reluctantly, as a survival strategy. And if it is adopted reluctantly, then beneath the monuments and laws there may be a persistent undercurrent of resistance, memory of older ways, longing for mobility, skepticism toward institutions. That undercurrent rarely appears in official records. It appears in the cracks, in abandoned settlements, in outlawed practices, in myths that preserve older freedoms in coded form. The question becomes, if civilization was triggered by pressures and contagion, what traces remain of those who refused it, and what does their silence tell about what was lost? Silence can be a trace when one learns how to listen to it. The people who refused the city, or who left it when it became too heavy, rarely left grand inscriptions explaining themselves. Their choices are preserved more often as absences, a settlement that thins out, a neighbourhood abandoned, a shift in pottery style that suggests migration, a sudden return to simpler architecture, a landscape where fields revert to scrub. From the perspective of a state, these absences can be interpreted as failure, backwardness, chaos. From the perspective of those who walked away, they might have been acts of preservation, attempts to recover flexibility, dignity, or safety in a world where the city's promises began to sound like demands. The problem is that states write. Refusers do not always write, or their writings do not survive. This imbalance shapes history. If the archive is the voice of the institution, then the archive will naturally frame dissent as illegitimate. It will call escapees bandits, nomads, barbarians, rebels. It will record the triumph of conquest more eagerly than the quiet relief of those who avoided conquest. Over centuries, these labels can harden into categories that later readers accept as reality. The city becomes the protagonist. Those outside become scenery, danger, disorder, or emptiness. Yet the outside was rarely empty. Many regions supported complex mobile societies, trade intermediaries, pastoral networks, and communities that resisted permanent settlement not because they were incapable, but because they understood the costs. Mobility is an intelligence. It is a strategy for surviving uncertainty. It prevents dependence on a single harvest, a single river, a single authority. When climate fluctuates, mobility can be safer than storage. When states become predatory, mobility can be a form of defense. The refusal of civilization in this sense is not always refusal of complexity. It can be refusal of vulnerability. This reframes the trigger question once more. If civilization is contagious and often imposed by competitive pressures, then the first civilizations may not have been universally desired. They may have been tolerated, negotiated with, resisted, copied, avoided. The emergence of the city would then be part of a wider ecological and political shift. The appearance of states creates new kinds of threats and opportunities, forcing surrounding societies to adapt. Some adapt by becoming states, others adapt by becoming harder to capture, moving, dispersing, forming alliances, specializing in trade or raiding. The world becomes a chessboard where not all pieces agree to play, yet all are affected by the rules. History, however, tends to be written as though the chessboard is the only world. This is partly because cities leave ruins that can be excavated, while mobile societies leave lighter footprints. But it is also because later empires, religions and knowledge systems inherited the state's preference for legible narratives. A state loves categories. It loves borders. It loves lists. It loves origin stories that make its existence feel inevitable. Over time, this preference can influence not only ancient records, but modern scholarship and popular understanding. The birth of civilization becomes a celebration of state formation, and resistance becomes a footnote. There is an unsettling possibility in this, that civilization's origin story has been curated not to deceive, but to reassure. Reassurance that hierarchy is natural, reassurance that centralized authority is progress, reassurance that the world moves from disorder to order. Such reassurance is comforting in societies built on institutions, yet the archaeological record, when listened to patiently, often suggests a more anxious reality. Order is fragile, contested, periodically abandoned. The city is not destiny, it is one strategy among many, and it carries cost that many humans clearly recognized. Institutions that preserved knowledge, temples, palaces, later imperial bureaucracies, also shaped which knowledge was considered legitimate. Oral traditions, local practices, and alternative cosmologies could be dismissed as superstition, even when they contained ecological wisdom. An official script could replace earlier scripts, rendering older texts unreadable. A conquering empire could impose its language, pushing others into silence. A religion could redefine sacred history, absorbing older myths and reinterpreting them within new frameworks. Over time, the deep past becomes layered under reinterpretation, like a city built on a city built on a city. This layering can produce the illusion of a single coherent narrative, yet it can also hide discontinuities. A founding myth may actually be a patchwork of older tales. A royal genealogy may be a political construction rather than a factual record. A law code may be presented as ancient tradition even if it was recently standardized. These possibilities do not require a dramatic secret committee rewriting history. They are simply how power behaves over time. It prefers continuity, and it manufactures continuity when needed. Modern knowledge systems are not immune. Archaeology and history, though rigorously methodical, are also shaped by what can be funded and studied. Certain regions receive more attention. Certain interpretations become dominant because they fit familiar models. The language of civilization itself carries assumptions that cities and writing are superior, that state formation is advancement, that complexity without states is incomplete. These assumptions can influence which questions are asked and which are dismissed. They can also shape public fascination with lost civilizations, because when mainstream narratives feel incomplete, the imagination looks for what has been excluded. Yet exclusion is not only political, it is also geological. Sea level rise swallowed coastal settlements. Rivers buried cities under silt. Earthquakes collapsed structures. Deserts advanced. Forests reclaimed fields. Time is an editor more relentless than any empire. It erases without ideology. It preserves unpredictably. It leaves future generations with a skewed archive, where some cultures appear loudly and others whisper or vanish. This skew can be mistaken for intentional suppression, when it may be the simple cruelty of preservation. Still, the effect is the same. We inherit a partial record and we build grand stories on it. The trigger question, therefore, cannot be answered as a single sentence. It must be held as a tension. Civilizations likely appeared because multiple pressures converged: climate variability, resource management, population density, trade networks, conflict, the technologies of record keeping, the social glue of ritual, the legitimacy machinery of rulers. But the story we tell about those pressures is shaped by what survived, by what institutions preserved, and by what later societies found useful to emphasize. This leads to a final, more intimate unease. If civilization emerged not as destiny but as a contested strategy, then what was lost when it won? Perhaps flexibility, perhaps alternative forms of equality, perhaps ecological balance, perhaps ways of knowing that did not depend on archives, perhaps a different relationship with time, one less dominated by debt and schedules. These losses are difficult to prove archaeologically. They appear as absences, as silences, as faint gestures in myth. The next layer of fog waits in the act of looking back itself, because once a society believes that history has a clean origin, it becomes easier to accept the present as inevitable. And if the present is accepted as inevitable, the future becomes easier to control. The question that remains is not only what triggered the first civilizations to appear, but what that belief about their appearance has triggered in us, what it has made humans willing to accept, again and again, whenever the world becomes uncertain and the promise of order begins to sound like salvation. If the belief in a clean origin makes the present feel inevitable, then the oldest mystery is not buried in a ruin. It is buried in a habit of mind. Humans look at the first cities and search for a trigger because a trigger suggests a moment of clarity, a single lever pulled, a door opened. Yet the past often refuses the simplicity that the nervous mind craves. The first civilizations may not have appeared like a spark. They may have accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of small decisions, each reasonable in isolation, until the weight of the layers made another kind of life impossible to imagine. In that sense, civilization is less an invention than a convergence. Climate shifts make seasons less reliable, and reliability becomes precious. Grain and domesticated animals create surplus, and surplus becomes measurable. Measurement invites records. Records invite administration. Administration invites centralization. Centralization invites inequality. Inequality invites enforcement. Enforcement invites ideology. Ideology invites ritual. Ritual invites legitimacy. Legitimacy invites permanence. Permanence invites larger scale. Larger scale invites deeper dependence on water, trade, and coordinated labour. The system tightens like a knot. There is no single moment when the knot becomes a knot. There is only the moment when it can no longer be untied without tearing something essential. And yet, within this convergence, there are thresholds that feel like triggers. The first time a storeroom becomes communal rather than household. The first time a debt is recorded so it outlives the debtor. The first time a wall is built not as temporary protection but as the definition of belonging. The first time a ritual calendar becomes an administrative calendar. The first time an elite burial makes inequality visible enough to teach children what they are. The first time a seal impression carries authority farther than a person can walk. These are small turns, but they are decisive. They reshape human expectations. They teach people to live inside systems. Perhaps the deepest trigger is psychological, the gradual internal acceptance that life can be governed by abstractions, that a mark can outrank a memory, that a schedule can outrank a desire, that a boundary can outrank a path, that a law can outrank a relationship. Once that acceptance settles, a society can scale into a city, a state, an empire. But the acceptance is not neutral. It changes what humans fear and what humans hope for. It changes the definition of safety. Safety becomes membership in an institution. Safety becomes compliance. Safety becomes the promise that the machine will keep running. This is why civilizations can feel both miraculous and ominous. Miraculous because they coordinate thousands, create art, preserve knowledge, build structures that outlast lifetimes. Ominous because they can also standardize suffering, concentrate inequality, and make violence systematic. The same machinery that prevents famine can create poverty. The same writing that preserves wisdom can preserve debt. The same walls that protect can imprison. The same rituals that unify can exclude. Civilization's trigger may therefore be inseparable from its shadow. The conditions that create the machine also create what the machine will do. And then there is the additional complication that keeps the mystery awake. Beginnings do not always survive. Sea level rise swallowed coasts. Rivers buried settlements. Fires baked clay, tablets into survival, while destroying everything else. Conquest erased rival archives. Scripts changed. Languages died. A civilization could rise and fall without leaving a readable signature, especially if it built in wood, recorded in perishable materials, or organized complexity without monumentality. In that case, the first civilizations we know may be the first that were legible to later eyes, not the first that ever occurred. This does not require fantasies of advanced lost empires. It requires only humility about preservation. The record is partial. The record is biased towards stone, clay, and state institutions. The record favours those who wrote and those whose writing survived. The record makes the city louder than the countryside. the palace louder than the marketplace, the king louder than the worker. The past that reaches us is not the past in full. It is the past that made it through multiple filters: geology, ecology, politics, copying, translation, modern excavation priorities. Each filter is indifferent, yet together they shape what feels true. So what triggered the first human civilizations to appear? A convergence of pressures and possibilities? Yes. The warming and instability after the Ice Age, the seduction and tyranny of stored grain, the binding force of irrigation, the administrative revolution of records, the widening dependency of trade, the organizing power of belief, the hardening of inequality, the discipline of defense, the invention of legitimacy. But perhaps the more haunting answer is that civilizations appear when humans begin to fear uncertainty more than they value freedom, and when institutions learn how to transform that fear into structure. It is tempting to leave the story there, neatly arranged. Yet a neat ending would betray the very pattern that runs through the ruins, the pattern of discontinuity, restart, and selective memory. Civilizations rise, fall, and rise again. Each time, humans inherit fragments of the last system's habits: the desire for order, the reliance on records, the tendency toward hierarchy, the use of ritual for cohesion. Even when people rebel against oppression, they often rebuild new forms of administration. The machine is hard to unlearn. It becomes part of human imagination. And that is the quiet warning that hovers over the ancient question. The search for a single trigger is not only about the past, it is about the present. When modern societies tell themselves that civilization began as progress, they may become more willing to accept new versions of the same bargain. Freedom exchanged for security, complexity exchanged for control, living memory exchanged for recorded authority. The past becomes a justification. The origin story becomes a spell. If there is a final image to hold, it is not a city glowing at dawn. It is a shoreline at night, where waves erase footprints before they can harden into evidence. Somewhere beyond that darkness, earlier experiments may have risen and fallen without leaving names. And even in the places where names survived, what remains is not certainty, but a question, steady as water moving through channels. When humans first built the machinery of civilization, did they know they were building a shelter? Or did they also build a cage that would become so familiar it would be mistaken for the shape of the world?